Avoidants are madly in love with this specific person, and the strange part is, they often don't realize it until that person is already gone. Not because avoidants don't have feelings, not because they are incapable of love, but because the very emotions they spend years trying to avoid are often the same emotions that quietly attach them to one specific person in ways they never expected. If you've ever wondered why an avoidant can seem completely detached on the surface while secretly carrying someone's memory for months, years, or even decades, then you're about to understand something most people never see. And as you watch, you may suddenly recognize someone you've known, or maybe even yourself. And if this kind of deep psychology fascinates you, take a second to subscribe. Chances are, if you found this video, you're already asking questions most people never think to ask. Now let's get into it. One of the biggest myths about avoidance is that they never truly fall in love. People see the distance, the emotional walls, the mixed signals, and assume there is nothing underneath. But the reality is far more complicated. Avoidants often feel deeply, sometimes deeper than people realize. The difference is that they experience love through a filter of fear. Every feeling must pass through questions about safety, independence, vulnerability, and control. While others may move directly toward connection, avoidants often move in two directions at once. Part of them wants closeness. Another part immediately begins calculating the risks of that closeness. This internal conflict creates a confusing experience, where they may care intensely about someone while simultaneously pulling away from them. And because of this, the person who ultimately captures an avoidant's heart is rarely the person everyone expects. It isn't necessarily the most attractive person. It isn't always the person who gave the most attention. It isn't even the person who loved them the hardest. Instead, it tends to be the person who accidentally bypassed their defenses and reached a place inside them they normally keep hidden from the world. The person who somehow became unforgettable without trying. The person who stayed in their thoughts long after logic suggested they should have moved on. What surprises many people is that avoidants rarely fall in love through constant closeness. In fact, excessive closeness can sometimes create the opposite effect. Most relationship advice teaches that more communication, more reassurance, and more emotional intensity automatically strengthen connection. But for an avoidant, too much intensity too quickly can feel overwhelming. It can feel like standing too close to a fire. Even if the warmth is comforting, the heat becomes difficult to tolerate. Their nervous system begins interpreting connection as pressure. Expectations start feeling like obligations. Emotional dependence starts feeling like responsibility. And suddenly the very thing they wanted becomes something they feel compelled to escape. This doesn't mean they don't care. It means their protective instincts have been activated. The tragedy is that many people mistake this withdrawal as proof that the avoidant never had feelings. In reality, the withdrawal often happens because the feelings became too significant. The more emotionally important someone becomes, the more vulnerable the avoidant feels. And vulnerability is exactly where their deepest fears live. So instead of moving closer, they create distance. Instead of leaning in, they step back. Yet while they are creating physical or emotional space, their mind often becomes increasingly occupied by the person they are trying not to need. This is where something fascinating begins to happen. The people who affect avoidance the most are often the people who don't desperately need them. Not because avoidants enjoy rejection, not because they want coldness, but because independence feels safe. An independent person sends a powerful unconscious message. They communicate that connection is a choice, not a demand. They have their own life, their own identity, their own sense of purpose. They are not looking for someone to rescue them, complete them, or constantly validate them. And to an avoidant, this feels surprisingly comforting. There is less pressure, less expectation, less fear of being consumed. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant can relax enough to experience attraction without immediately feeling trapped. What begins as comfort slowly evolves into admiration. They notice how this person carries themselves, how they continue moving forward regardless of who stays or leaves, how they seem emotionally grounded without becoming emotionally unavailable. And before long, the avoidant finds themselves thinking about this person more than they intended, not because they were chased, not because they were persuaded, but because they encountered someone who seemed complete on their own. Then another layer emerges. Avoidants become deeply intrigued by people they cannot fully figure out. Human beings naturally value what remains partially unknown. But this tendency can be especially powerful for avoidance. Predictability often feels safe, yet complete predictability can sometimes reduce curiosity. The person who affects them most is often someone who remains authentic while still retaining a sense of mystery. Not someone playing games, not someone intentionally being difficult, but someone whose inner world cannot be completely mapped out in a single conversation. Someone who continues revealing new dimensions over time. Every interaction creates another question. Every answer opens another door. And because avoidants spend so much of their lives observing from a distance, curiosity becomes one of the strongest pathways to emotional investment. They begin replaying conversations, analyzing moments, wondering what the other person truly thinks, feels, or dreams about. The connection starts occupying mental space even when the person is physically absent. Without realizing it, they become emotionally attached through fascination. What began as curiosity slowly transforms into something much deeper, something harder to explain, something that follows them into quiet moments when nobody else is around. But perhaps the most important factor of all is this: the person avoidants fall hardest for is someone who makes them feel safe, without making them feel trapped. That balance is incredibly rare. Most people unintentionally lean too far in one direction. They either create distance that feels cold or closeness that feels overwhelming. Yet every once in a while, an avoidant encounters someone who seems to understand an unspoken truth. Someone who allows connection to develop naturally. Someone who doesn't force vulnerability but welcomes it when it appears. Someone who offers warmth without pressure, presence without control, affection without ownership. Around this person, the avoidant experiences something unfamiliar. Their defenses don't have to work as hard. They don't feel cornered. They don't feel managed. They don't feel responsible for carrying another person's emotional world. For perhaps the first time, closeness begins to feel compatible with freedom. And that experience leaves a mark. Because once an avoidant discovers that connection can exist without suffocation, they never completely forget the person who showed them. Even if years pass, even if circumstances change, even if life pulls them in different directions, the memory remains, quietly waiting beneath the surface, growing stronger every time they compare future connections to the one person who somehow made them feel both safe and free at the same time. And what makes this even more powerful is that the person who creates that feeling is usually not the person who chases after the avoidant when they begin to pull away. In fact, one of the most confusing experiences for an avoidant happens when someone simply allows them to leave. Most people assume that if you want to keep someone's attention, you must fight for it, convince them, pursue them, and prove your devotion over and over again. But avoidants often expect pursuit. They expect people to react emotionally. They expect messages, explanations, pressure, and attempts to re-establish control over the connection. When those reactions arrive, they may feel temporarily reassured, but they rarely feel truly drawn closer. Instead, it confirms a pattern they already understand. What catches their attention is something entirely different. It is the person who remains calm, the person who does not collapse when distance appears, the person who does not beg for answers or demand reassurance. Suddenly, the avoidant encounters something unfamiliar. Instead of feeling chased, they feel the absence of pursuit, and that absence becomes loud. Questions begin forming where certainty once existed. They start wondering why this person isn't reacting the way everyone else did, why they seem okay, why they continue living their life, why they remain emotionally steady despite the uncertainty. What started as a withdrawal meant to create space slowly turns into curiosity, and curiosity begins pulling the avoidant back toward the very person they expected to keep running after them. There is another reason this particular person becomes unforgettable. Avoidants often have a complicated relationship with control, not because they want to dominate others, but because control creates safety. If they can manage expectations, regulate closeness, and maintain enough emotional distance, they feel protected from pain. The problem is that real connection cannot be fully controlled. The people who impact them most are often the people who refuse to surrender their boundaries. These individuals are kind, but they are not easily manipulated. They are compassionate, but they do not abandon themselves to maintain a relationship. They understand their worth independent of anyone else's approval. To the avoidant, this creates an unexpected emotional reaction. At first, it may feel frustrating. They cannot predict every response. They cannot assume unlimited access. They cannot rely on the connection existing regardless of their behavior. Yet underneath that frustration lies something deeper: respect, genuine respect. Because deep down, avoidants often admire strength far more than they admit. They admire people who remain true to themselves, people who maintain dignity even when emotions are involved, people who are capable of loving deeply without losing their identity. Over time, that respect transforms into attraction. And attraction built on respect tends to last much longer than attraction built on excitement alone. the avoidant begins recognizing that this person cannot simply be placed on a shelf and revisited whenever convenient. They exist as a complete individual with their own standards, choices, and direction, and suddenly the connection feels more valuable because it is not guaranteed. Then comes one of the most unsettling experiences an avoidant can have. They meet someone who sees through the image they carefully present to the world. Most avoidants spend years developing ways to appear unaffected. They learn how to minimize emotions, redirect conversations, and maintain an appearance of self-sufficiency. To most people, these defenses remain invisible. But every once in a while, someone notices what exists beneath them. Not through interrogation, not through pressure, but through observation. They recognize the hesitation hidden inside confidence. They notice the vulnerability disguised as independence. They sense the loneliness that sometimes exists beneath the desire for space. And for the avoidant, this experience feels both terrifying and magnetic. On one hand, being understood threatens the very defenses that have protected them for years. On the other hand, being understood satisfies a longing they rarely admit exists. Because despite all appearances, avoidants want to be known too. They want someone to recognize the parts of themselves they struggle to reveal. They want someone to understand that distance does not always mean indifference, that silence does not always mean absence of feeling, that independence does not always mean absence of need. When they encounter someone capable of seeing these hidden truths without judgment, something profound happens. They feel exposed yet accepted, vulnerable yet safe. And those experiences are not easily forgotten. What makes the bond even stronger is that this person never tried to fix them. This may sound simple, but it creates an enormous difference. Many avoidants move through life feeling as though others are constantly trying to improve, repair, analyze, or change them. Every conversation becomes an assessment. Every flaw becomes a project. Every defense becomes something that needs to be dismantled. While these efforts are often well-intentioned, they can leave avoidants feeling fundamentally misunderstood. They begin believing that connection is conditional upon becoming someone else, but the person who stays in their heart the longest approaches them differently. Instead of treating them like a problem to solve, they treat them like a human being to understand. They recognize strengths alongside weaknesses. They allow growth without demanding transformation. They offer acceptance without requiring perfection. And for someone accustomed to feeling evaluated, this experience can be life-changing. Suddenly, they are no longer defending themselves against constant correction. They are no longer performing to meet someone else's expectations. They are simply allowed to exist. Ironically, this acceptance often creates more personal growth than criticism ever could, because people tend to change most naturally when they feel safe enough to be themselves. The avoidant may never fully express how much this meant to them, but internally it leaves a permanent impression. Years later, they may struggle to remember specific conversations, yet they remember how they felt around this person. They remember the relief. They remember the absence of pressure. They remember what it was like to be accepted before they believed they deserved it. And perhaps that is why authenticity becomes such a powerful force in the avoidant's emotional world. The person they fall hardest for is rarely the person who played a role. It is rarely the person who carefully crafted an image designed to impress. It is the person who showed up as themselves, fully human, imperfect, honest, real. Avoidants spend much of their lives navigating appearances, expectations, and emotional calculations. Because of this, authenticity stands out with extraordinary clarity. They notice when someone is genuine. They notice when words align with actions. They notice when kindness is offered without hidden agendas. And while they may not immediately admit how much these qualities affect them, they absorb them deeply. Authentic people create a kind of emotional imprint that remains long after circumstances change. The avoidant finds themselves remembering small moments years later. A conversation that felt unusually honest. A quiet act of kindness nobody else noticed. A moment of vulnerability that carried no expectation of reward. These memories linger because they represent something increasingly rare, a connection that felt real, not performed, not manipulated, not manufactured, real. And when an avoidant encounters someone who embodies that authenticity, the experience often becomes the standard against which future relationships are unconsciously measured. Long after the relationship changes, long after distance enters the picture, and long after both people continue moving through life, the memory remains alive. Because some people do not stay in an avoidant's heart due to intensity. They stay because they felt genuine. And genuine things are much harder to replace than most people realize. And this is where the story takes a turn that many people never see coming. The connection becomes most powerful not when the avoidant is standing face to face with the person, but often when that person is no longer there. Distance has a strange effect on avoidance. While many people process emotions in real time, avoidants frequently process them in reverse. During the relationship, their attention may be occupied by concerns about freedom, vulnerability, expectations, and emotional exposure. Their mind is busy managing the discomfort of closeness, but once distance enters the picture, something changes. The pressure disappears. The expectations fade. The immediate demands of connection are gone, and suddenly, all the feelings that were competing with fear begin rising to the surface. Moments that seemed ordinary become meaningful. Conversations gain new significance. Small memories start replaying unexpectedly. It is as if the emotional reality of the relationship arrives late, showing up after the relationship itself has already changed. This delayed awareness is one of the reasons avoidants can seem detached in the moment yet deeply affected months later. They may not fully understand what someone meant to them until they experience life without that person, and when that realization arrives, it can be surprisingly intense because it comes without warning. A song, a place, a familiar phrase, or even a random quiet evening can suddenly bring everything rushing back. What often lingers most is not grand romance or dramatic passion. It is something much simpler: the person who made them feel normal. For many avoidants, there is a hidden fear that they are somehow difficult to love. They may never say this aloud. In fact, they often appear highly confident and self-sufficient. But beneath that exterior, many carry concerns that if people saw their fears, contradictions, and emotional complexities, they might eventually leave. So they spend years managing impressions, controlling vulnerability, and protecting themselves from potential rejection. Then someone comes along who makes all of that effort feel unnecessary. Around this person, they do not feel defective. They do not feel like a puzzle that needs solving. They do not feel pressured to become a different version of themselves. They simply feel accepted. There is a unique kind of peace that comes from being around someone who allows you to exist without constantly proving your value. And for an avoidant, that peace can be more addictive than excitement itself. Because excitement fades, validation fades, even attraction can fluctuate. But the memory of feeling emotionally safe often remains. Long after specific details disappear, they remember the feeling. They remember how easy it was to breathe. They remember how natural conversations felt. They remember the rare experience of not having to guard every part of themselves. And that memory becomes increasingly valuable as time passes. This is why their mind keeps returning to one specific person even when they genuinely try to move forward. Most people assume memory works like a filing cabinet. They imagine that relationships can be neatly categorized, processed, and stored away. But emotional memory works differently. The experiences that stay with us are often the ones that remain emotionally unfinished. The avoidant may tell themselves they moved on. They may build a new life, pursue new goals, and create new relationships. Yet certain memories continue resurfacing because they were never fully explored when they first occurred. Questions remain unanswered. Feelings remain unspoken. Vulnerability remains unrealized. The mind naturally revisits what it never completely resolved. This is not necessarily because they want to go backward. It is because part of them is still trying to understand what happened, why that person felt different, why they continue comparing new experiences to an old connection, why someone they have not seen in years can still occupy space in their thoughts. The answer is often simpler than they expect. That person represented something emotionally significant, something that reached beneath the surface defenses they relied upon for so long. And once a connection reaches that depth, forgetting becomes much harder than pretending. Eventually, there comes a moment that many avoidants never anticipated. A moment when attraction quietly evolves into something much deeper. The irony is that they often do not recognize it immediately. Love for an avoidant rarely arrives with certainty. It does not announce itself dramatically. It emerges gradually, hidden beneath layers of rationalization and emotional caution. They may call it admiration, they may call it respect, they may call it attachment, fascination, or curiosity. Anything except love. Because love requires acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability remains one of the most uncomfortable experiences they know. Yet over time, the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. They notice that this person occupies a unique place in their thoughts. They find themselves caring about that person's happiness even when they receive nothing in return. They imagine conversations that never happen. They wonder how that person is doing during moments of quiet reflection. They celebrate their successes from a distance and feel unexpected sadness during times of separation. Slowly, they realize that what they feel extends beyond attraction. Attraction focuses on what someone provides. Love begins caring about who someone is. And that realization can be both beautiful and frightening because it means they have crossed a line they spent years trying not to cross. They have become emotionally invested in a way that cannot easily be reversed. Yet just as this realization begins taking shape, another powerful force often emerges.